Hello everyone, thank you for joining. My name is Chelsea Shetler and I am the Marketing Coordinator here at Hosting. Today's webinar is part of a larger discussion we've been having on security, hacking, and protecting your company from data breaches this fall. Like with today's pop culture references on things like hacktivism and the TV show Mr. Robot, we thought it would be timely to bring you Hacktivism Culture DDoS 101. So just a quick little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and an on-demand version will be available at the same URL at the conclusion of the webinar. Please submit questions via the button on the upper left of your viewer. If we don't get to your question during the webinar, we will follow up with you via email. You can download related resources via the attachments button above the viewing panel, so you can take home those PowerPoint slides from today, as well as a white paper for further information on DDoS. And if you're on Twitter, please join the conversation, #Hacktivism @CloudFlare and @hosting.com. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers this afternoon. We have Larry Collins, Product Manager here at Hosting, and James Askham, Solutions Engineer at CloudFlare. Thanks so much for joining you guys.
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. Again, this is Larry Collins here with Hosting, Product Manager in Denver, Colorado. Hosting's advanced DDoS protection is powered by our partner CloudFlare, and today CloudFlare delivers protection to over 4 million websites globally, from personal blogs to large enterprises. And we're certainly pleased to have James join us as our guest speaker. He's going to cover what a DDoS attack is from a technical perspective, as well as the most common types of attacks, and certainly the best practices for mitigating against those attacks. So James, certainly appreciate you joining us this morning, and I'll turn it over to you for this afternoon.
Hi there, Larry. Thanks for having me, guys. Yeah, so I'm just going to go ahead and get right into this. So DDoS is probably a term many of us have heard in the news or in the media, probably due to high-profile events recently. They do affect everyone on the internet, and they can cause major disruption. So they affect application owners, bloggers, gamers, business executives, everybody. On average, we're seeing roughly 124,000 DDoS events occurring every single week on the internet. And there's a growing trend to the number of events that we're seeing year on year. DDoS attacks are growing in size. To put it into context, in 2016, in the first 6 months, we saw 274 attacks that exceeded 100 gigabits per second in attack size. That's compared with 2015, where we saw 223 events over 100 gigabits per second in the entire year. DDoS stands for a distributed denial of service. Distributed meaning that the attack source is coming from many locations on the internet, and the target intention of a DDoS is to overwhelm a web service or application to make it unavailable to legitimate users. So I put together a list here of some of the main motivations and reasons why people commit or carry out DDoS attacks against targets. The first being extortion, and this is probably the most common that we see at CloudFlare. This is where an application owner is held to ransom, essentially being told via email that if they don't respond and pay a sum of money to the attacker, then their web property or application will be taken offline. Another common reason we see is business competition. A recent Kaspersky study suggested that 1 in 8 companies attacked with a DDoS believed that the source of the attack was a business competitor. Hacktivism, the primary focus of the presentation, is another common reason for DDoS attack, and this is the use of computers or networks to promote political ends, chiefly free speech, human rights, and information ethics. These kind of attacks are often organized and carried out by well-known groups such as LulzSec and Anonymous. They are a form of protest, and famous media incidents, such as the attack against the Church of Scientology in 2008, or the Department of Justice being taken offline when they attempted to block Mega Upload, are good examples of where hacktivism has come into play. Script kiddies are often to blame as well. This is a term used to imply lesser skilled individuals are able to carry out DDoS attacks through the use of attack scripts that are freely available and gained via social media, for example. Lizard Squad is a name you may hear in terms of this, and it's a group of young, unskilled DDoS attackers. Also, security feints and internal testing are less common reasons for DDoS. Security feints meaning that the primary DDoS or the initial attack may be used as a cover for a follow-up attack to potentially exfiltrate data. It can distract the primary IT security team's attention from the real problem that's going on behind the scenes. So to summarize, the primary motivations being money, protest, mischief, and again, to reiterate, money. Categorize DDoS attacks into these two high-level categories. The first being bandwidth attacks. And these DDoS attacks are the most common and probably the most trivial to execute. They consume resources such as network bandwidth or equipment by overwhelming one or the other or both with a high volume of packets. The explicit goal of a layer 3 attack is to target an IP address and overwhelm it with junk traffic. Alternatively, we have application attacks. These are slightly more sophisticated as they exploit the use of well-known protocols to try and exhaust the available resources within the target's host server. So attack traffic doesn't generally just come from a single machine where an attacker sits. It can do, but more often than not, it comes from what is known as a botnet. So a botnet is a dispersed group of compromised servers or computers, laptops, tablets, home routers that have been exploited and had some form of malware installed upon them. Attackers can then control this botnet or zombie servers from a single attack station. And with the malware that's installed on those devices, they can launch attack traffic from there. With the proliferation of IPv6 and the increase in internet-connected devices, such as Fitbit devices, home fridges, home routers, smart TVs, we're seeing billions of new devices that connect to the internet on a daily basis. These are often put out to market with vulnerabilities, weak firmware, weak default usernames and passwords that can make them very easy to exploit remotely to have the malware scripts installed upon them. Also, we're seeing people can actually hire botnets. What are called booters or stressors can be purchased on the internet for people to launch their own DDoS attack. So they don't even need the skill to actually deploy the malware. It's been done for them, and now it's being sold to them as a service so that they can purchase an attack type, the duration of an attack, a particular target, and the size, as if it was an a la carte menu. So focusing on the bandwidth attacks, the volumetric DDoSes we see. The internet is made up of a vast number of internet-connected networks, and connection between these networks is finite and cannot easily be increased. So if you run a server at a hosting provider, it may be the case that you only have a 1 gigabit per second maximum link between yourself and the internet. What we see from these botnets is that it's very easy to overwhelm that 1 per second link by targeting an IP address with junk traffic. Take, for example, the 1 gigabit per second link. If a single compromised device within a botnet can generate 20 megabits per second, it's only going to take 50 nodes or so that can overwhelm an individual target. The graph you can see here, this is an example of an attack that we saw against one of our customers. This one in particular was Spamhaus in 2014, and you can see that well over 100 gigabits per second of junk traffic was being targeted at their web properties through our network. And that's corresponded by this gigantic spike in the green traffic. The goal of this type of attack is to overwhelm the target. Hardware devices, we often see, can be flooded themselves with traffic. So if you have a DDoS mitigation device, often the links connecting themselves to the internet can be overwhelmed. ISPs target this problem by null routing of IPs, so that essentially traffic to the target IPs just gets black holed. But that has the downside of obviously taking the web service offline at that IP address, and then the website owner having to either wait it out or get themselves a new IP address assigned for their web service. And these type of attacks are very simple to generate. Any type of traffic will work, and it can be launched as long as an IP address is routable on the internet. Often the source IP address from where the attacks originate is also spoofed. So it's very difficult within a firewall just to simply block the traffic from the IP, because one, the firewall could potentially be overwhelmed, but two, the IP address could be completely fake. Okay? These types of attacks can also lead to inflated bandwidth costs for the victim, as they see an increase in downloads as their network link is saturated. So basic layer 3 volumetric DDoS like this is considered symmetrical. The attacker has to generate the amount of traffic that actually gets received by the victim. That means there's quite a lot of effort involved in terms of the number of nodes required to generate a particularly large DDoS attack. We also see what are known as asymmetric attacks. Now these are ones whereby an attacker can generate a very small request, but have a very large payload of information delivered at the victim to knock them off-site a lot easier with fewer nodes. This lends itself to what are known as reflection attacks or amplification attacks. Here what we have around the world are what are known as authoritative DNS servers, and they have DNS requests made of them from DNS resolvers. So whenever you type google.com into your web browser, it asks your resolver, where can I find the IP address of google.com? Certain resolvers are shared and used by many people around the world. Google 8.8.8.8 is a good example of this. But on some networks around the world, what are called open resolvers exist, and these allow DNS requests to come from spoofed source IP addresses. So what you can get is a compromised machine within a botnet making a DNS request with a spoofed source IP. The DNS resolver goes out, finds the response, the DNS response, and then returns it to the fake IP address, which will be the victim's IP. What this can also allow is for an amplification vector, in that the request is much, much smaller than the payload. Take, for example, a DNS any request is a very common one we see. A single DNS any request can have an amplification of 50 times the payload. So the response is 50 times larger than the request, and that gets delivered to the victim, potentially knocking them offline. Any UDP-based protocol that doesn't require this authentication, like DNS, can be used as an attack vector in a DNS, in an amplification or a reflection attack. NTP is a very common one that we see as well. So the network time protocol on port 123, whereby people who are running unsecured NTP servers, that is to say they don't require a username or a password or have any means of authenticating the client making a request, can be used to generate huge amounts of attack traffic. And just to put it into perspective, I've put together here a few amplification factors of the response sizes. DNS 50 times, but NTP can be anywhere up to 550 times the size of response to the actual request. And this amplification factor is how we're seeing such large DDoS attacks in the media these days of 600 gigabits per second plus going into 2016. Okay. The graph you see here was posted on Twitter by one of our users, and it represents an NTP server that they run within their own network that they realized was exploited as part of a botnet. And you can see that it was one of 4,500 NTP servers that were involved in an attack of 400 gigabits per second. So as I go up the stack, I can talk about some slightly more advanced types of DDoS attack that we see, and most of these exploit well-known protocols and weaknesses inherent within them that allow the DDoS attack to occur. So the most common being an exploit of the TCP Three-Way Handshake. So whenever a client and a server need to communicate over HTTP or HTTPS or anything that requires a reliable communication, a TCP connection must be established. This process involves the sender sending a SYN or a synchronized bit, the receiver receiving this and sending a synchronized acknowledgement bit, and then the sender receiving that acknowledgement before they then send their HTTP request. When the receiver receives a SYN request, it has to utilize some of its resources within a listener table to keep track of all of these synchronized requests that it's seen. And every one of those uses up a little bit of resource, so a bit of CPU and a little bit of memory to store that information. Okay? And what this allows potential attackers to do is an exploit known as a Syn Flood, whereby a botnet, for example, generates a lot of these SYN requests to establish a TCP connection against your host or your server. Your server then creates a half-open TCP connection, but then the attacker never sends the corresponding acknowledgement and GET request. Usually because they've spoofed the source IP address, but regardless, your server will keep half-open connections alive, and resources will be exhausted to the point where they can no longer accept legitimate requests. This is a classic Syn flood. In a TCP connection flood, it's very similar, except that a full connection is established, so it's not possible for the attacker to spoof their source IP. But once the TCP connection is established, it's just kept open, and no HTTP or HTTPS traffic gets sent. This again exhausts the available TCP connection sockets on a server and renders it inaccessible to legitimate visitors. Okay. These types of attack can also overwhelm network devices, so it's not just web servers where they maintain connection state. If they get overwhelmed, again, no new legit connections can be made. I've put on here another type of attack as well. This is a layer 7 attack. So it's similar to a TCP connection flood. It's known as a slow loris or a Rudy attack, whereby a TCP connection gets established and HTTP requests get made, but they're never full requests. So the server sits in a waiting state waiting for the request to be completed, which it never is. And again, it exhausts available TCP connection slots. Okay. With these last two, although they do have the source IP address associated with where the attack is coming from, that's often not enough just to put a block within a firewall to say do not allow this traffic, because often the traffic is coming from these compromised machines that make up the botnet. So they could be legitimate people who just don't realize their machine is a source for the attack traffic. And the attackers can then just continually use different IP addresses regardless. Application attacks are slightly more advanced, and these impact people at a much deeper level than the volumetric attacks. These include things like SQL injection and cross-site scripting attacks, but also people exploiting a web application in terms of just making thousands and thousands of requests for large assets can be enough to render a web server unavailable as it processes those requests. People may be downloading large files or just brute force attempting to log in on the login screen with HTTP post messages. It's also not just the web service that can be targeted. Also the DNS servers themselves, often overlooked by people, can be targeted and render a web server unavailable. And in the example I've given here, just a regular flood of DNS requests can be enough to knock somebody's DNS server offline, thereby making the IP address unavailable to legitimate visitors when they make DNS requests for a particular web property. What I thought I'd do now is just focus on some of the high-profile exploits, just a few of them that we've seen at CloudFlare and that we've helped to mitigate over the years. The first being Spamhaus. Spamhaus run an email spam blocking service whereby IP addresses that are known to be generating spam email get blacklisted. This unfortunately made them a target, whereby the people who generate the spam traffic targeted them and launched a 300 gigabit per second volumetric DDoS attack against their infrastructure, which knocked them offline initially. They approached CloudFlare, and we managed to bring their services back online by putting their website behind the CloudFlare reverse proxy solution. More recently, again, during the Hong Kong pro-democracy elections, the University of Hong Kong had a website called the Public Opinion Program, which ran a mock election to poll people's opinions on the election candidates. And this was targeted, and somebody attempted to knock it offline. Suspicion is that this was a state-sponsored attack whereby a whole country had ordered the attack to knock the site offline. But what we did at CloudFlare was we stood in front of the attack at 500 gigabits per second of junk traffic and managed to keep that service online by absorbing all of that traffic through our reverse proxy solution.
And James, actually, we have a...
Yeah.
James, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. We actually have a question.
Okay.
Kind of since we're on the topic, timely. How large of a DDoS attack can CloudFlare handle?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So at CloudFlare, because of the distributed nature of our network, we have data centers in over 100 locations. And by the way that our network works, we can distribute all of the attack traffic across those data centers to absorb attacks. Theoretically, we have up to 10 terabits per second of capacity across all of our data centers combined. So an attack up to that number could theoretically be mitigated through the service. The largest we have stood in front of is roughly 600 gigabits per second. And the largest that the internet has ever seen is only just over 1 terabit per second. So we have 10 times the capacity of the largest attack that's ever been seen. that answer your question?
I think it did. Perfect.
Great stuff. So I have here an example of one of the extortion emails that was received by one of our customers. These are released by groups such as DD4BC and Armada Collective, whereby they send an email to an executive within a company warning that a DDoS attack is imminent, and unless a sum of money is paid, typically, like in this example, via Bitcoin, the attack will go ahead and it will knock them offline, potentially costing them money. Okay? So in this example, they've asked for $9,000 roughly within 24 hours. In the group Armada Collective, research has shown that they have made over $100,000 just from these types of emails and people actually paying the money in the hope that they don't get attacked. The irony of this being that because people are paying by Bitcoin, as you can see in this email here, it says that you do not need to reply, just pay the money, they will know that it's you. Bitcoin is an anonymous currency, so they therefore have no means of checking that it was you who paid. So they could still very likely launch the DDoS attack regardless. Okay. Often, in our experience recently as well, we have seen that these are hoax emails whereby no attack ever actually materializes as a result of one of these emails. That's not to say that they definitely won't, we just don't know. Okay. So many of the people who come to CloudFlare asking for assistance have received one of these, and they want to put protection in place so that should the event occur, they're well protected and they don't need to pay any money. Payment of the money is probably one of the worst things people can do, as it just encourages this cycle to continue. Okay. So going into 2016, we are seeing much, much larger DDoS attacks as well. Now this has come about primarily through the number of internet-connected devices I mentioned previously. What is known as the Internet of Things is a phrase that you'll probably hear, and this is just the proliferation of internet-connected devices which can form these gigantic botnets that are made up of millions of nodes that can generate these huge volumes of attack traffic against targets. Some good recent examples of this being Krebs on security. So Brian Krebs is a security writer, and he was obviously targeted and made an example of for exposing the tricks of the trade, if you like, of the people exploiting the security hacks. And also OVH, a hosting provider, they received an attack of over a terabit per second. Okay. So, what can we do against all of these attacks? If we know we're going to be attacked, or we potentially could be, at CloudFlare we offer a service whereby we can stand in front of these and protect you against DDoS attack. Okay. So we also offer DDoS. In addition to DDoS, we provide DNS services. We proxy roughly 15% of all internet requests that are made today on our network, and over 4 million domains trust the use of CloudFlare to protect them. That translates into roughly 1.5 trillion page views every month. 15 trillion attacks have been stopped in this year alone. In addition to security, we also offer CDN services. So we save our customers bandwidth costs by offloading it from our caching services, and we save roughly 300 petabytes of bandwidth for our customers every month. So how does CloudFlare work? Essentially, when people sign up to our service, the primary security mechanism is that we hide the IP address of your web server or your web service behind our reverse proxy. So when people do a DNS lookup for your host name, they find a CloudFlare IP address rather than your real IP address. And that is all most attackers will need or use to launch the DDoS attack itself. They will target the IP address that they get from doing a dig or an NS lookup against your host name. CloudFlare becomes the authoritative DNS service for your domain. This allows us to respond with our IP addresses rather than your origin IPs. When you do this, we can also work for web assets that you don't wish to proxy through CloudFlare. You can turn the proxy off and we respond with origin IPs as normal, like any other DNS provider. Okay. For CloudFlare, we run what is known as a globally distributed anycast network. So any IP address that is associated to your domain on the CloudFlare service gets advertised from every one of our 100 data centers around the world. The benefit of doing this is that visitors, when they go to your website, they get routed via a protocol called BGP to the nearest CloudFlare data center geographic to their location. Where we described before, we had botnets that have distributed compromised nodes launching the attack traffic from all over the world on various networks. Their attack traffic actually only gets routed to the nearest CloudFlare data center, rather than everything hitting your one origin server. This dilution effect allows us to absorb these huge volumes of traffic by spreading it across all of the CloudFlare data centers. So once the traffic of visitors reaches CloudFlare, we scrub it and we look for potential attack traffic as well as legitimate traffic, and we make intelligent decisions on whether or not we should allow traffic to pass through or whether we should block it or present a challenge as an alternative. This diagram just represents what I've described there, that people get routed to their nearest location. With our CDN services, this also has the benefit of bringing content for legitimate users much closer to their location. So download times improve dramatically for that content as well. This diagram just shows the spread of the CloudFlare data centers, very evenly distributed over the world. And we're typically bringing on new data centers every few weeks. The benefit of this is every new data center adds to our potential attack capacity that we can sustain, as well as improved CDN performance for those visitors accessing your application from the other parts of the world. Every continent is represented on the map here by a CloudFlare data center, and we've targeted internet exchange points so we can peer with as many different ISP networks on the internet. What this means is people have optimized routing once they go through the CloudFlare network to get between any 2 points on the globe. And data centers include mainland China as well, so we can dramatically improve performance for visitors where application users connect from China. Here's a list just representing the cities in which CloudFlare is present. So in terms of DDoS mitigation services, at CloudFlare, we run an IP reputation database. So every time we see a malicious visitor or a malicious user or a botnet generating traffic against our network, their reputation is changed accordingly. So we know exactly where the bad visitors on the internet exist today, and we can implement challenges and blocks based on this information automatically. As we see every single IP address on the internet roughly 200 times a day, we've become very accurate at determining who are good and who are bad. In terms of the volumetric DDoS attacks we described, we drop UDP-based traffic at the CloudFlare edge. and 10 terabits per second of network capacity can absorb most of this. And CloudFlare runs a very large IP space, so we can easily null route IPs as we give each customer multiple IP addresses on our network that they can use.
And James, actually, I see a question just popped up on my screen. So besides DDoS attacks, is there any other known attack that CloudFlare has seen in connected home devices? What is the most devastated aspect of the connected home device attack?
Mm-hmm. To my knowledge, the primary attack from home devices is this launching of volumetric DDoS attacks, more so than anything else. Where we have application-specific attacks being made, we do run a web application firewall, which scans every single request made to CloudFlare, looking within HTTP requests for particular patterns that make up other vulnerabilities that can affect applications directly, such as cross-site scripting, SQL injection. Those are the primary types of attacks we see, but I'd be happy to look into any other types of exploits that are being generated from home devices in particular, and give some feedback after the webinar.
Perfect. And I'm also seeing one more. I'm concerned about the latency sending my traffic through a reverse proxy, such as CloudFlare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So that's a good question. Obviously, there is additional routing involved to get traffic to CloudFlare, but as I mentioned, we do run on optimized networks, peering with as many ISPs as possible. So for many cases, we find that the optimal routing through the CloudFlare network is a good trade-off against the additional hop that is incurred through going to CloudFlare. Also, because we run a CDN, we are caching assets much, much closer to visitors than having to go to origin servers directly. So again, there is a large time saving in terms of the download of content through our CDN service. As well as with things like SSL, we do intelligent SSL session resumption and TCP connection reuse when connecting from the CloudFlare Edge servers to any origin server, as well as a range of performance features that can optimize the load time of back connection as well, such as dynamic content caching, using our product called Railgun.
Beautiful. I think that answers them for right now. Keep them coming, though. You can go ahead. I think we can move on.
Sure. So, in terms of the layer 3 attacks, we are dropping UDP and ICMP floods. They're just absorbed by the CloudFlare network. TCP Syn Floods never get established because the CloudFlare Edge, obviously, it maintains that TCP connect request. It never reaches the origin server, and unless we see the acknowledgement come back, we won't proxy the traffic through. And we have the capacity to drop unmatched TCP SYN packets. In terms of TCP connection floods, we have intelligent timeouts. So when no traffic is received for a period of time, the connection is just dropped. And again, it is kept away from ever connecting with the origin server. And as I mentioned, we have a web application firewall to address layer 7 attacks, but also rate limiting features. So as part of our ongoing commitment to releasing new security products, we have a feature called traffic control, which is due to be released very, very soon, in beta currently. And it allows people to determine or define exactly what rate of requests per second can be made from any given IP address against a URI on an application. And this can help to protect against HTTP GET flood and other layer 7 exploits, such as brute force login attempts. And to that point, here's a few other security features offered by CloudFlare. Every customer who signs up to CloudFlare gets use of their own SSL certificates included with every package. So this can immediately improve the security and performance of any web application by enabling SSL. And with that comes the ability to support what's called HTTP 2, which is a performance enhancement feature over the old HTTP 1.1, whereby all assets within a web application can be downloaded over a single TCP connection, rather than having to establish many TCP connections and adding additional latency to download web pages. Okay. We see that registrars are also an attack vector that people exploit, whereby they can hack into registrar accounts and potentially change name server configurations and direct traffic to legitimate sites away to attackers. Also DNSSEC. In a similar vein, we can prevent man-in-the-middle attacks through the use of DNSSEC, which validates that authoritative DNS responses have come from a known good authoritative DNS server for the domain. Those are just a few of the security features that we offer in addition. And finally, performance as well. As I mentioned already, we have CDN and SSL certificates, but also DNS and a range of website optimization features such as HTTP 2, image compression technologies, and dynamic content optimization. Finally, one of the major benefits of CloudFlare is our predictable bandwidth costs. So when you sign up for a CloudFlare plan, it is a fixed monthly fee that you will pay for the service, regardless of the attack size, regardless of potentially how much data is downloaded through the service. The fee does not change. And we have a range of self-service plans as well as customizable enterprise plans as well. Cool. Well, I've spoken for 43 minutes. Seems like it's gone quite fast. Does anybody have any questions for me?
Yeah, I'm seeing one, and I think this actually, Larry, this might be more geared towards you. If I'm a current hosting customer and I'm under attack, can I quickly sign up for the CloudFlare service?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you are a current hosting customer, we appreciate you joining us this afternoon. Yeah, matter of fact, we do have emergency onboarding procedures for this type of event. We use CloudFlare's API to quickly onboard a subdomain and obviously make the necessary DNS changes. And I know just 2 days ago we did this for a customer and brought them back online rather quickly. So it works really well.
Beautiful. And also, CloudFlare, are you expecting to see an increase in a number of these attacks as we're kind of approaching the holiday season in anticipation of companies needing their websites to be reliable and up, and already the increase in traffic in e-commerce? Can you speak to that a little bit, James?
Absolutely, yeah. So certainly it's a trend that we see. It's very much a seasonal aspect to DDoS attacks. And as we go into the holidays, we do see a pronounced increase, particularly against our e-commerce customers who need to have 100% availability, particularly with Black Friday and Cyber Monday on the way. So yeah, there's certainly an uptick and more CloudFlare customers coming on board at that time of year.
Perfect. All right. I'll give everyone a couple more seconds here to get any last-minute questions in. In regards to that, thank you so much, James and Larry, for joining both of us. Oh, I see one more. Just kidding. What is the difference between CloudFlare CDN versus Akamai CDN from the functionalities aspect?
Yeah. So with the CloudFlare CDN, we operate out of all of our data centers rather than just a few of them for our CDN service. In particular, SSL traffic is supported from all locations. So we have slightly more points of presence in regard to SSL traffic. In terms of bandwidth, costing is probably the primary difference as well. So they will charge for overage and usage fees, whereas the CloudFlare CDN is all inclusive within the pricing.
Perfect. Any other questions left from the audience here? I know we've given you guys a lot to think about for the past 45 minutes. We do love these security webinars because at the very least they tend to give people a lot of things to think about when it comes to security at their company. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions, but if you do have some still, you can keep asking them. They do get emailed to us, and we can have Larry or James reach out to you via email. And of course, everyone, thank you so much for joining this afternoon. I really hope you enjoyed kind of the discussion we had. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us directly through Bright Talk, through those email invitations we sent you. And we really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy afternoon to come engage with us. So thanks again, James and Larry, for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, James.
No problem. Thank you. Bye-bye.